Hey everybody, so in this video I'm going to talk about how I got my 132, a perfect score on this Psych Social section of the MCAT. And I did it without paying for any resources other than the AAMC exams, the practice, all the full lengths and the section banks and stuff, and without paying for any tutors or anything like that. And also, by the way, without taking the courses or without, really without benefiting from courses, as we're going to see in a second. So this section is really quite an interesting section of the MCAT. And the reason it's so interesting is that it was added, it's the newest section. So in 2015, the makers of the MCAT sort of revamped or changed the system. Most infamously, they changed the scoring. The scoring used to be out of 45. Each section was out of 15, and there were 3 sections out of 45 total. Of course, now it's out of 132 for each section, and then the total is out of 528. So they changed the scoring, and then they also added a section. And the previous 3 sections more or less corresponded with the other 3 sections of the MCAT, and this is really the new section of the MCAT. Now, there's a little bit like some of this type of material was sort of included more in some of the CARS stuff, and a little bit, or the former CARS, which was verbal reasoning. But more or less, this is a new section. And I think it's worth knowing why they added this section, just to really, while you're studying, you don't always feel like, why am I doing this? Like, why do I even have to know this stuff? And so there's a recognition that physicians really, that the practice of medicine is not just about treating bodies, it's also about treating people. And people are really part of a broader social context, right? And so people often suffer, for example, from mental illness that's often inseparable from their physical health. You can't necessarily, like oftentimes the two really run hand in hand. And it's very important for physicians to at least have some awareness of the field of psychology. And then sociology also. There are often a lot of illnesses, a lot of diseases that are, or most diseases, I should say, are correlated with poverty, with many social indicators, inequality, things like that. And having an understanding of sociology, of how these types of inequalities, how these types of risk factors really come about, is important for becoming a good physician. And so when the MCAT tests these subjects, it really tests them in the context of how they might apply to the practice of medicine. Now, there's occasionally a little bit of random stuff, but for the most part, that's what it is. And the other thing I would say that doesn't quite fit in with either like psychology or sociology explicitly is it teaches you how to evaluate experiments and how to understand experiment design. And I'm going to do a separate video on that because I think it's an interesting and useful topic. And that's kind of sprinkled in with all of this material. It's not really explicitly one or the other. And then, of course, we call this a psych social section, but there is a bit of biology. And that biology is mostly the biology that sort of is linked to psychology. So neurology, understanding the different parts of the brain, understanding things like that. And so the biology I've already covered in my biology course. So I'm not really going to talk about it here, and there's really not that much of it anyway. Oh, and then the other thing about the biology is some of the senses, the eyes, the ears, things like that. So, but again, for the most part, we'll focus here on psych and soc. All right, so now the number one resource that I recommend is this psychology course. So if you're like me, I took psychology in undergrad when I was trying to study for a semester or 2 before I studied for the MCAT. But for many different reasons, I didn't learn anything from that psychology class. I took it online. It wasn't fun. It wasn't a good experience. And I did not have any understanding of the field whatsoever when I went to study for my MCAT. So I might as well have not taken that course. I also took a sociology course and kind of a similar deal. Didn't really work out. And so I didn't have an understanding of the material at all. And if you're like me and you feel like you don't understand psychology or sociology, or maybe you need a refresher, I would say basically everybody other than maybe psych majors. Psych majors are probably good. They probably already know the foundations of their field, would benefit from this psychology course here. So if you don't know, most universities will put their courses online for free, or put some of their courses online for free for students to participate in and to access. And so Yale put their course with Professor Paul Bloom online. And in general, universities put their courses, the courses kind of function as advertising for the university. So the universities will tend to post their best professors. And Professor Paul Bloom, I think, is one of the greatest professors that I've seen. And he's actually very influential, very well known. He's published now in The Atlantic and the New York Times. You might actually encounter him if you're reading something just unrelated to this field, maybe for your CARS, for example. And so he teaches this intro course, And you can find this intro course on YouTube for free. And I think really the best way to find this is just to search on YouTube Yale Paul Bloom, and this will be the first result. So you can click view the full playlist, and you'll get the full playlist. You'll see here there are about 20 lectures, and they're really good. I think he's a really great lecturer, and honestly, I would watch this course even just for entertainment if it wasn't for the MCAT. And when I did the MCAT, I watched it I think 3 times. So once very early on, once over the course of my studying, and then once I kind of binged it in the week leading up to my exam. And I think there's a lot of benefit that you can take. He really does a great overview of the concepts of any type of an intro to psych course, and really a great overview for the types of stuff that you need to know for the MCAT. And oh, by the way, there's a fun fact. In lecture 9, he brings in a guest lecturer, Peter Salovey. Peter Salovey talks about love, talks about the causes of love, what psychologists understand about love. And Peter Salovey is kind of the world expert on love. He's probably the most published person in that space. And just a fun fact, Peter Salovey is actually now the president of Yale University. But that actually brings me to a point, which is that this course is kind of old. So it's about 15 years old, as you can see here. And that's not really a bad thing. I think it's perfectly fine. But it does sort of, there are occasions where I think that it's a little bit behind on what the latest stuff in the field is, but that's not really an issue for an intro course. And so that would be maybe one slight downside of this course. But again, I'm a huge proponent of using this to study. And the great thing about it is you can use it to really passively study. So let's go ahead and click lecture number 1. So we see here that some of the material projected was not shown. Essentially what that means is that you don't always see what's being projected on the screen when he's talking. And that is really not an issue because most of the visuals, I would say like 99% of the visuals are not necessary to understand what's happening. And that actually means that this course is quite good to listen to, like a podcast, or when you're driving, or when you're at the gym, or whenever you typically will listen to podcasts. And that means that really you can use this passively to study. So you don't have to sit down and watch and take notes. In fact, I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think that's the best use of your time. But I would recommend, especially early on when you're studying, listen to this lecture series. And again, as I said, he's a very entertaining professor. He's very funny, and he really does a great job of explaining the material. And don't feel bad if you don't understand or you don't get everything that's being said on your first pass. You're not really expected to. What you want to do is you want to have enough familiarity with the concepts. So you want to, when you finish watching this series for your first time, you want to have enough understanding of what the concepts are. Just in general, you want to be able to recognize some of the experiments that he talks about. So for example, he might talk about the Ash conformity study, which is essentially you bring a bunch of people into a room. They're all working with you, the experimenter, except one who is the test subject. And you ask them which line segment is longer. You give them 2 lines that are similar in length, and you ask essentially which one is longer. And all the other people who are working with you are instructed to lie and pick the wrong one. And then you're trying to see if your test subject is also going to lie, try and conform with the group, or if they're going to kind of independently pick out the correct answer. And so this is just one example, and this type of experiment has been repeated in many, many different contexts. And so if you have an understanding of these types of experiments, and you have an understanding of the types of experiments that he talks about, then when you go into the rest of your studying, you're going to have a huge, huge leg up and a good amount of context for when you're doing the rest of your stuff. And so again, I'd recommend watching this series relatively early on before you start doing vocab and stuff. And then if you want, you can also watch it again or listen to it again as you get closer to your test date. And actually, I remember when I was studying for my MCAT, I said that in the last weeks, I binged this series. What I did was every time I wasn't studying, I would go out for a bike ride. And when I would go out for a bike ride, it was a nice sort of a break from my studying. And I justified it to myself by listening to this series while I was biking. And so it kind of functioned as a nice break and also good review of the psych concepts. And as I said, I do credit this series a good amount for helping me get that 132 because it really gave me a good understanding of really the context of the field. And I remember there was one question that I totally wasn't expecting and wouldn't have studied. I think it was something about Freud or something just really bizarre, but because he talked about it, Professor Paul Bloom did mention it in his series, I was good. And so again, I really recommend this series. Now, the second form of studying that I recommend is vocabulary. This is probably what people have told you when you've asked people, or if you've heard, or if you've seen things online about this, that it's just a vocabulary section. And I don't think that's entirely true, but I think there's a good deal of truth to that. That's one reason why I recommend this course for really understanding the concepts and stuff. But once you understand the concepts in general, you really have to get really good at memorizing terms and being able to fit terms and vocab to the concepts that you've learned. So, for example, you know that that when a group of people who think alike are all in a room together, for example, let's say we've got a group of people who are all Republicans or all Democrats, and when they all start talking, chances are they're going to end up more Republican or more Democrat. They're going to become more extreme in their view. And so, kind of common sense, not really that difficult. But what is the name that psychologists give that term? So there's a name for it. And so, just as an example, if you understand the concept, for example, you'll be super good as far as understanding experiments and stuff, but you want to be able to tie it to the term. And so it really requires both knowing the concept, being able to bring up, say, an example of the concept, and being able to tie it to a particular vocab term that psychologists use to describe this type of a concept. And so again, in general, when you want to review terms, what I recommend you do is review the concept. You want to have an understanding of the concept, and then you want to be able to link it with the vocab term. And then crucially, you want to be able to distinguish between similar terms. So I mentioned group polarization. What's the difference between that and groupthink? And it often helps to have an example in mind of that type of a concept. So for example, group polarization, I mentioned that, say, if we've got people who are politically partisan, they will often become more extreme. There's a lot of discussion over whether social media does this these days. Social media kind of silos us into our own little bubbles and creates group polarization. Groupthink is a little bit different. It's when a group of people who are engaged in kind of a similar task or feel maybe pressure from outside are reluctant to sort of criticize the group or reluctant to bring out concerns. And so a couple of classic examples of that are often brought up in the literature. For example, the Space Shuttle Challenger, which exploded and killed all the astronauts on board in the 1980s. There was a meeting before the launch over whether the launch should go ahead because the temperature was too cold. And the temperature was too cold, and some of the O-rings, some of the parts of the shuttle were not designed to handle that. And so people met, and essentially nobody really wanted to cancel the shuttle. Nobody wanted to be the guy who said, we should cancel this and to take the blame for it. And they all felt under pressure. They felt, the president was going to ask them about what had happened. And so in the end, nobody contradicted the group. And so that's different than group polarization. And so again, people facing pressure from outside are reluctant to criticize the group, even if they individually feel uneasy about the situation. And so again, understanding and being able to distinguish between terms in that way. And then finally, understanding how studies are designed and considerations that go into designing studies. And again, I'm going to do a separate video on that, so I won't talk about that here. But really, like 90% of this section is understanding concepts and being able to link them with vocabulary terms. And one final thing that I haven't mentioned, if you're still having trouble with a particular concept, that you can use the Khan Academy series. So Khan Academy's series on Psych Social is really, really good. The only downside is it's also very long. And so when I studied, I think what I did is I think I did go through the whole thing, but I don't think I paid attention to it that much. I think I turned it on when I was doing something else, which might not have been the best use of my time, to be honest, in hindsight. So I would recommend you kind of selectively go through it. In particular, if you're pretty good on the psychology with the Paul Bloom course, so this is mostly psychology, and this is really the bulk of the course, as you can see, of the Khan Academy material. If you're then still kind of struggling with some of the sociology material, you can use just the sociology material, and you can see that's a lot more manageable in terms of time. And you can also put it on like 1.5x or 2x speed, and that'll also help. And so again, I would say these three resources are going to be the most useful for Psych Soc. There are additional resources that people have used. So some people, for example, use UWorld. Some people use a very long PDF with all of the material. And I'll put a link to those in the description. But I didn't use those, and I don't generally recommend people use them. I'm not saying I recommend not to use them, but I don't think they're absolutely necessary. And I think you can do perfectly fine by understanding the concepts, reviewing vocab, and of course, you got to do a lot of practice questions. So that's the one thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is AAMC practice tests, section banks, practice questions, practice reading graphs, practice parsing experiments and stuff like that. That's going to be absolutely essential as well. And so this is my recommendation for the Psych Soc section. I know a lot of people have been asking me about this. A couple people have emailed me to ask about this. And so I'm glad I was able to get the video out. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you have any personal questions, you can always email me. And if you want to check out my review courses for the science material for the MCAT, please go to my website, acmcat.com. Otherwise, thank you for watching.